So, Donald Trump wants to buy Greenland. And despite what you may have heard, it would be easy if you had $2.9 trillion lying around. But be careful what you wish for, because the whole affair can teach us something about how the Western world is currently constructed. Or at least was constructed? Anyway, number 47 wants to plant his flag way up north. Personally, I can't blame him. It is beautiful out there. And Trump is always looking to make big splashes with foreign policy. No wonder he went back to what was originally a 2019-era proposal, before even reciting the oath of office for a second time. However, the broad reaction has been that a sale is not possible, and that we should all just move on from this. The situation is not, say, a repeat of the Treaty of Danish West Indies, when Washington acquired what is now the U.S. Virgin Islands, in part because Copenhagen was eager to sell them. Well, I'm here today to explain that it is very much possible. But again, whether it is a good idea is an entirely different question. However, the knee-jerk reaction of the deal's impossibility has suppressed discussion of why it is economically a bizarre idea. And that is a shame, primarily because of what Western countries have been building for the last 80 years, but also because that is where the strategically interesting discussion lies. So, today, we should explore why a deal is possible doing some heavy lifting there, and then we will turn to why plausibility is the problem, the implicit political costs of such a deal in the United States, the lack of strategic value added for the geopolitical military map, and problems with the resource acquisition theory of the deal. Oh, and then we will have some fun with a coerced forced sale. But let's start with why a deal is, in theory, possible. This all got started when Trump wrote a note on Truth Social. For purposes of national security and freedom throughout the world, the United States of America feels that the ownership and control of Greenland is an absolute necessity. It was the Christmas season, but Copenhagen was not in the giving spirit. The bluntest response came from Denmark's Prime Minister, probably already frustrated because her intelligence community was telling her that this all stemmed from a forged letter by Russia. Anyway, she said, "It is not for sale," partially describing Denmark's own position on the matter, and partially alluding to how Greenland has home rule, basically an autonomy agreement with Copenhagen that dictates that Greenlanders decide domestic affairs, while Denmark handles its foreign policy. More on that in a minute. That should be the end of the media discussion about the feasibility of the issue, right? The PM says no, and that's all there is to it. Right? Well, "it is not for sale" is just not true. Ted DiBiase, a Nobel-winning economist and friend of Trump's incoming Secretary of Education, said it best: "Every man has his price." Let's imagine that, tomorrow, Trump proposed an arbitrarily large amount, say $29 trillion. Then let me tell you, "it is not for sale" would instantly change to "how quickly can you send over the paperwork?" Doing a little bit of math, $29 trillion works out to just shy of $5 million per Dane. Every politician saying no to that prospect would lose their seat in Parliament in the following election. Sure, there would be the rare individual who would still raise a fuss based on their ideological principles. But money talks, and they would lose that battle. Now, this may be the right moment to return to how Greenland has home rule, so paying Denmark does not mean much here. Well, that being the case, home rule just pushes the question to a different domain. If the people of Greenland wanted to make it happen, they can declare independence via referendum, and then begin negotiations with the Danish parliament. Afterward, they would just raise Old Glory and call it a day. Currently, Denmark sends an annual grant to Greenland worth about $500 million. That amount makes up roughly a sixth of Greenland's GDP, and half of its government budget. So the United States could promise investments on the island that would be compelling, win support of the people there, and force Denmark to negotiate independence, followed by annexation by the United States. Let me pause this hypothetical exercise to point out that Denmark can always increase its own subsidy as a means to convince Greenland to keep the current arrangement. And in terms of what might actually happen, that is something to keep an eye on. However, the key thing here is that Greenland's population is tiny. What you are looking at now is Nuuk, Greenland's largest city. It has a population of 20,000. The island's total population is under 57,000. Thus, $29 trillion goes a long way there. In fact, it is so small that even if you continue giving everyone in Denmark an equal share, we are still looking at $4.9 million per person. But how they divide the figure among themselves is beside the point. So too is how much autonomy to negotiate for American Greenland. Obviously, those details would matter in practice, and we will return to the political implications for Washington in a second. Nonetheless, the real point of the section is simply to point out that, with enough money, a deal is readily possible. Now, I guarantee you that there will be some comment below from someone who insists that there would be some constitutional problem or some other legal barrier to stop a sale from happening. But I cannot stress this enough. It is remarkable how many laws can evaporate overnight when everyone is being offered $5 million. That said, 29 trillion was not in fact an arbitrary number. It is the annual GDP of the United States. So yes, Greenland is for sale. And to address the title of How Trump Could Buy Greenland, the answer is just pay a ton of money. The real question, though, is whether the most that Washington is willing to pay is more than what the minimum is to sell. Remember, Trump likes to promote himself as an expert negotiator, and would not want to create a perception of getting a bad deal for Greenland. In turn, we need to start thinking about what the US value for Greenland is. That itself consists of three parts: the implicit costs of a transaction, its strategic value, and its direct costs. The implicit costs are basically ignored in the media. The public discourse surrounding the strategic issues is good, but it misses how Trump is aware of this and is a smokescreen for the direct value part. Meanwhile, the discussion regarding direct value is bad because it tends to solely focus on whether there is wealth under the ice. And that is not what the implications are for negotiations. Let's start with the implicit costs, because that will be fast. And what I really want to discuss is what it would mean if Greenland became the 51st state. Did you catch the number of stars there? I've been using this flag a bunch. Now, I cannot tell you whether Greenland would pursue US statehood or want to carbon copy its autonomy arrangement with Denmark. However, I will note that, politically speaking, it is much easier to continue receiving economic benefits if you have representation in Congress. But that has a spillover effect. Let's replicate the process from when Alaska and Hawaii entered the Union, resulting in extra seats until the following census. What you are looking at now is the current division of the US Senate. When you count Angus King and Bernie Sanders as caucusing with the Democrats, you wind up at a 53-47 split in favor of the Republicans. Greenland, in all likelihood, would be a reliably blue state, narrowing the current gap to 53-49. Notably, that would have been enough to tank Pete Hegseth's confirmation as Secretary of Defense, given that there are 3 Republicans who defected from party lines on that vote. Meanwhile, the situation is close to identical in the House, where Republicans have a 218 to 215 majority, and Greenland's additional seat would narrow it to 218 to 216. Meanwhile, again, here is the electoral map from the 2024 election. It is not hard to create a scenario where Greenland's addition could flip the outcome. For example, imagine that Democrats continue to make progress in the Sun Belt, but cannot return a blue wall to the Rust Belt. Specifically, they flip Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. That would result in a 269 to 269 electoral college tie. The election would move to the House of Representatives, in which each state has a single vote, and in turn would assuredly result in the Republican winning. Add 3 votes for Greenland, though, and it is now a 272 to 269 win for our new Democratic president. The point is that Greenland makes governing that much harder for Republicans, and that is something that they would have to think about before making any change here. It is also why the idea of Canada as a 51st state is silly. Remember, Washington cannot even acknowledge the District of Columbia as a state, never mind these other entities. To be fair, this has always been a problem for the United States, dating back to issues with slavery, or what to do following the Mexican-American War. Greenland and DC are just the current iteration of the issue. Next, let's tackle the strategic dimensions here, which really means military value. And there is none. Sorry. Now, I do not mean that Greenland is not strategically valuable. It is. Rather, I am talking about value added here. To see what I mean, it helps to take a trip due north, way north, and look at Earth from above. If a Russian nuclear weapon were to decide to pay the United States a visit, it would have to pass somewhere in the neighborhood of Greenland. Similarly, if US bombers wish to fly to Russia, Greenland makes for a good emergency landing zone. And that is not a hypothetical either. During the early Cold War, the Chrome Dome program put nuclear-equipped bombers in the air round the clock. One of them had an emergency and crashed as it attempted a special landing operation at a military base in Greenland. The warhead's conventional explosives detonated, but there was no nuclear chain reaction. Still, it left a lot of radioactive material on the ice to clean up. Back to the present. Greenland's Arctic position also makes it an ideal place to have a naval base to cover a new shipping lane. Call it a Northwest Passage, once the ice melts enough to permit that. Hold any thoughts about global warming for a minute. Oh, and also note that its position is important in case portions of Russia's Northern Fleet decides to pay a visit to the Western Hemisphere. Anyway, the reason that none of this matters in terms of a strategic value calculation is because the United States can build all of those things there already. That is the joy of NATO membership. It is collective defense. Both Denmark and the United States benefit from the security apparatus there, so territory is open for American development. Indeed, remember the nuclear bombers' attempted landing in Greenland? Yep, that was the US Thule Air Base, now the Badufik Space Base. How very 21st century. And it is way up north here, again in a useful strategic location vis-a-vis Russia. If the United States wanted to build anything else, it could get the Danish PM on the line, ask for a plot of land, and it would soon happen. Actually, that is basically what Copenhagen is telling Trump right now. I personally do not think Trump is oblivious to any of this. He loves to focus on how much the United States spends on NATO, and he loves the Space Force. Really loves it, like I said. Rather, it is a bit of a smokescreen for an uncouth motive to acquire Greenland. That still won't work very well. And that takes us to the direct value of Greenland's territory. The basic idea here is that the ice is melting on the island, about 270 billion tons of it per year, to the point that Greenland itself, no longer restrained by the extra weight, rises about 3 millimeters every year, and the loss of gravity is causing problems for the southern hemisphere. Anyway, that ice is likely a hotbed of oil, rare earths, and all sorts of other goodies that will soon become accessible. You can find various estimates of the total value of the resources online. I will not cite any here, though, because the true number is irrelevant to the main point, which will seem silly, but give me a minute. Have you ever played a game of The Settlers of Catan? No, today's video is not sponsored by Klostüber. Perhaps more fittingly, have you ever played a game of Monopoly in your life? If you have specifically played either game with just two people, then you probably quickly realized how boring that configuration is. What normally makes those games interesting is trading between players. Wood for two sheep? Boardwalk for my railroads? Unfortunately, such trades do not work when there are only two people in the game. They are legal, sure, but good players know that they are pointless. If it improves one side's ability to win, it will hurt the other side's chances by an equal amount. Heck, even if I am not particularly knowledgeable at the game, I will still refuse any trade you offer me. All I need to reason is that if you want to do it, then it must be good for you, which implies that it is bad for me. The games work much better with 3 or more players, because you and I can collaborate to simultaneously improve both of our chances at the expense of everyone else's chances. But 2 players? It just does not work. The problem there is a manifestation of a bigger finding known as the no-trade theorem. If all we are doing is speculating on the value of something, and there are transaction costs of any sort to the trade, then no trade can happen. To ground that idea, if Trump wants Greenland because oil and rare earths are valuable, then they are going to be valuable to Denmark as well. And even if Trump has some secret knowledge about why it is more valuable than it is publicly believed to be, then Denmark ought to infer Trump's information, even if it is private, update its beliefs that Greenland is more valuable than it thought, and still reject the offer. Under those conditions, trades only work if there is consensus on the value, and the price offered is exactly equal to that value, which basically renders the trade meaningless. But remember, the moment that it costs anything to make the trade, it becomes a negative proposition to both parties. And there would be a ton of transaction costs associated with transitioning Greenland's governance from Denmark and Home Rule to US dominion. To wit, I do not think anyone gets Bidufik right the first time. Where this can start working again is if there is a specific reason why US control of Greenland would suddenly make its value increase. I have not heard anyone articulate such, and indeed it is hard to imagine something like that, given that the most effective multinational corporations are likely to harvest the materials regardless of who holds the title deed. This would also work if the United States and Denmark/the Greenlanders are on different time horizons, that they need money now and can cash in on the island to obtain it. But given the high transaction costs, one wonders why Denmark or Greenland would not act like a normal country and just seek a boring old loan. A final possibility is that there is some non-fiscal value that the United States obtains by having Greenland that trumps Denmark's own non-fiscal value. At some level, we all know that this is the origin of the president's idea. Basically, that he views territorial expansion as what historians will see as a signature achievement. Well, we have already discussed how Denmark does not view Greenland as a liability, so it better be that the United States really likes it. You know, Trump is a populist, and the thing about populist policies is that they are, well, popular. Or at least they are most of the time. Buying Greenland is not one of them. Polls show only 40% of Americans support acquiring the island. Notably, 29% approved, but thought it was unrealistic. Now, Congress would need to act on this to make it happen. And, well, they are acting. This was in the actual media kit of one of the bill's sponsors. See? 100% real. It is called the Make Greenland Great Again Act. Again, not making this up. And I can only presume it is abbreviated to MGA. Anyway, the chance that it makes it through such slim majorities in both the House and the Senate is close to 0. There is one last tangent to shore up, though. The possibility of coercing Denmark to force a sale. Indeed, what really drove the headlines was Trump saying that he would not rule out using economic or military means to acquire Greenland. Oh, and also the Panama Canal. What I'm about to discuss here would be mostly the same story in a different region, but let's take it one video at a time. We have previously discussed how land purchases fit within the lines on maps framework, that a sale price can be misleading because it reflects how easy it would be to capture in the absence of a deal, and that the cash payment is better thought of as a negotiated settlement that leaves both sides better off than had they fought a war. The Louisiana Purchase provides a perfect example of that thought process. The United States paid very little to France because Napoleon was tied up in Europe and would have struggled mightily to defend Louisiana if bargaining had failed. In that regard, the United States does not have as much leverage here as it might seem. On the economic front, the United States only takes 5.6% of Danish exports and 2.5% of Greenland's exports. Thus, tariffs would put a dent in their economies, but would be far from crippling. On the military coercion side, such a strategy misunderstands basic economic forces of the modern age. Conquest is expensive for a country like the United States. As a rich country, it costs a ton of money to pay for an army. Potential soldiers have plenty of economic opportunities elsewhere, and so their salaries must be high to convince them to sign on. That is why, following the United States' defeat of Saddam Hussein, Washington did not annex Iraq. It simply set up a new Iraqi government and let Iraqi oil go back onto the international market. The alternative, trying to set up an extractive occupation regime, was simply too risky and too expensive given the alternative. Just think about how unpopular the US stay was there months after mission accomplished. Compare that to when Saddam Hussein invaded and briefly annexed Kuwait. Iraqi labor was relatively cheap by comparison, so extraction was profitable. Or at least it would have been had the international coalition not kicked him out. Or compare that to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is barely feasible, and only because economic development in the eastern part of the country is very low. Sure, there are some from Moscow and St. Petersburg that volunteer out of a bizarre sense of adventure. But the war would not be possible if the Russian state terminated at the Ural Mountains. All told, this is part of the reason why advanced economies have been at peace with each other for decades now. The juice of territorial conquest is no longer worth the squeeze. The United States would run into these problems with Greenland. Sure, its oil and rare earths would be nice, but trying to occupy Greenland and extract it all is a bigger headache than it is worth, when you could simply buy the goods instead. Never mind the implicit cost to the stability of NATO that would come along with doing so. In terms of some classic lines on maps, maybe the United States has the military capacity to assuredly take over the island, but the cost of war would be so great that it would make the whole venture mightily unprofitable. And a related side note about Panama. Just imagine the economic losses that would arise if the United States conquered it, and then local militant groups began a concerted campaign to bomb the infrastructure. We would essentially be looking at the Bab el-Mandab Strait 2.0, with angry Panamanians replacing Yemeni Houthis. And that is actually on land, and is therefore much easier to target than a narrow strait of water. Back at the topic at hand, that may play into why Danish intelligence arrived at the assessment that Russia inceptioned the idea into Trump's mind. However, Trump is less interested in dismantling NATO than he is in convincing Europe to pick up what he sees as its fair share of the tab. Denmark especially, currently spending 1.65% of GDP on defense. That is not 2%, and it is nowhere near the 5% that Trump is now pushing. Thus, occupying Greenland would not be a profitable venture, and it would come at further costs abroad. Look, the United States has made some bad miscalculations before, but this would be a new level of mistake. Meanwhile, rather than occupying my country, you could simply buy my textbook on game theory if you want to learn more about basic strategy in the world. That's right, I threw the curveball again. Check the video description for more information about it. Also, we have fresh content on the secondary channel regarding a contentious meeting between Russian business leaders and the Kremlin. But for now, if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.